Good morning, dear students. Welcome back in today's lecture of macroeconomics. In the last lecture, we have discussed about the basic idea of macroeconomics. We have also discussed that what macroeconomists study. So, in today's lecture, I will give you macroeconomic data on the US inflation rate, and we will see that how the history of US gives information to macroeconomists, how we can get different information from the historical data of a country. So, look at this example. We have the United States inflation rate, which is in percentage per year. There are different indicators to measure the inflation rate of any economy. For example, consumer price index, we are using CPI, the consumer price index, wholesale price index, sensitive price index, the GDP deflator. So, we will be talking about all these different indicators for measuring the inflation rate in the coming chapters. But to be specific, this graph is based on the indicator of real GDP deflator, the GDP deflator. So, if we look at the graphical representation of the US inflation rate, we can find different fluctuations for the US economy over time. The zero line means we have no inflation. The positive value means inflation. The negative value means deflation. So, we have two important concepts. One is inflation and the second is deflation. If the prices rises in an economy over time, it means that we are experiencing the inflation in that particular economy. If the prices are moving at a higher rate, it means that the inflation rate is high in that economy. However, if prices are decreasing over time, it means that we have deflation in that economy. But if the value is zero, it means we have neither inflation nor deflation. So, the zero line means no inflation, no deflation. The positive value means inflation, that it gives us a signal that prices are rising. Minus values means, for example, minus 5%, minus 3%, minus 10%, minus 15%, minus 20%. These negative values show us that we have deflation in a particular economy. But we are very interested that why different economies' interest rates are differ. Why some economies experience the higher rates of inflation as compared to other economies. Why some economies' inflation rate are in double digits, 10%, 15%, 20%. Why other economies' inflation rates are in a single digit, for example 5%, 3%, 2%. So, the main question is that why some economies are experiencing high rates of inflation while other economies are stabilizing their prices level. So, look at the graph. During the World War I, which started from 1914 to 1918, the First World War. Look at the inflation rate. The graph is at its peak level. It means that if we have a war situation, we will be having more inflation. So, World War I, the graph is at its peak level. But what about Great Depression of 1929? During the course of Great Depression, during the era of Great Depression, the graph is at its lower level, showing minus value of the inflation rate. But now look at the graph when there was a Second World War. So the graph is moving away from the 0 point. Similarly, for the Korean War, for the Vietnam War, for different oil price shocks, like in the era of 1970s, in the year 1973, we have the first oil price shock. So look at the graph. Then the consecutive second oil price shock. Similarly, 9/11 terrorist attacks. So all these different events, different wars, different shocks, different recessions affect the standard of living of people, which we are capturing through the indicator of the inflation rate. So the inflation rate measures the percentage change in the average level of prices from the year before, means from the last year. It measures the percentage change. It measures the percentage change in the average level of prices from the last year. For example, we have 2 years, 2019 and 2018. If we are measuring the inflation rate, if in the year 2019 the inflation rate value is 3%, it means that prices are rising at the 3% level. It means that we have a 3% inflation in that particular economy. The question is that how we will measure the inflation rate? What do we mean by the concept of CPI, the GDP deflator, and what are the differences between the consumer price index and the GDP deflator? So we will talk about these concepts, these macroeconomic indicators in the second chapter. Okay, when the inflation rate is 0, when the inflation rate is 0, it means we have no inflation and no deflation. When the inflation rate is above 0, when the inflation rate is above the 0 line, it means that prices are rising. So it means that we have inflation. If the value is more greater than the 0 line, it means that we have high inflation. If it is near to 0, it means we have low inflation. So when the inflation rate is above 0, it means prices are rising and we have inflation. When the inflation rate is below 0, it means that prices are falling. We have deflation. But if the inflation rate declines, if the inflation rate decreases but remains positive, it is decreasing on the one hand, but it is positive on the other hand, then what does it mean? It means that prices are rising but at a slower rate. It doesn't mean that we don't have inflation. It means that prices are rising. Yes, we have inflation, but the prices are rising at a slower rate. It means that we have inflation, but the inflation is not at its peak level. It is not higher. The value will be, for example, 2%, 3%, maybe 4%. So, if the inflation rate declines but remains positive, it means that prices are rising but at a slower rate. Inflation became most severe during the late 1970s when prices rose at a rate of 10% per year. So, during the late 1970s, from the graph we can see it that, look at, this is the graph between from 1970 to 1980 or 1981 or 1982. Look at the last 10 years. Almost during the case of first oil price shocks and second oil price shocks, it means that the inflation rate is higher, which is approximately 10%. So, during the late 1970s, prices rose at a rate of almost 10% per annum. But in recent years, the inflation rate has been about 2 to 3% per annum, indicating that prices have been fairly stable. If we analyze the graph of inflation rate for the US economy in recent years, we can see that the inflation rate has been about 2 to 3% per year, which indicates that prices have been fairly stable. Look at the graph for the last 10 years. It is below 5%. This is 5 means 5%. So, this, the end of the graph, the end of the figure lies between 0 and 5. It means that prices have been fairly stable in this time. Now, look at the US unemployment rate. This is another figure of the US economy. The US unemployment rate is in percentage of labor force. 0 means 0%, 5 mean 5%, 10 mean 10%, 15 mean 15%, 20 mean 20%, 25 means 25%, 30 means 30%. And on the horizontal axis, we have different periods. This is the historical performance of the US economy for the last century, from 1900 to 2000, and this is the unemployment rate graph. Look at the First World War. In the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, we have more unemployment. But look at the Great Depression, we have the highest unemployment rate. In the times of Great Depression, we have the highest unemployment rate because graph of the figure of the US unemployment rate is at its peak, more than 25%. Similarly, look at the Korean War, Vietnam War, different oil price shocks, and similarly 9/11 terrorist attack. So, this graph is fluctuating over time for the US economy. This is the US unemployment rate. It means that the US economy is fluctuating very hugely in terms of the unemployment rate over the last century. So, the question is, what do we mean by unemployment? What does it measure? So, the unemployment measures the percentage of people in the labor force who don't have jobs. The percentage of people in the labor force who don't have jobs. So, this figure shows that the economy always have some unemployment, and that the economy and that the amount of unemployment fluctuates from year to year. It means that we don't have, if we see the figure of the US unemployment rate, we will find that there is no zero value. The unemployment rate doesn't touch the zero value. It means that yes, there is some unemployment. If it is zero, it means that no one is unemployed in the US economy. Mean the whole citizens of the US economy are working somewhere else, but this is not the case. It means that the figure shows that the economy always have some unemployment, maybe 10%, 2%, 3%, but still there is some employment, and that the amount of unemployment fluctuates over the period, over the sample period, which is a century. So, it means that the amount of unemployment fluctuates. It depends. During the time of Great Depression of 1929, the graph of the unemployment rate is at its peak level. During the period of Vietnam War, during the period of Korean War, during the era of 1970s, we have different fluctuations in the unemployment rate. But one thing is that there is no long-term unemployment trend. If we look at the graph, we don't have a long-term continuous trend. We don't have a long-term trend in the unemployment rate. It means that the amount of unemployment varies over the years. There is no continuous unemployment rate in the US economy. There is no continuous long-term trend in the US unemployment rate. So, recessions and depressions are associated with usually a high unemployment. So, during the times of recessions and depressions, the economy of US is experiencing a high rates of unemployment. The highest rate of unemployment were reached during the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the 1930s, or in the 1929, in the year 1929, there was the highest value of unemployment for the economy of the United States. Now, the question arises that why learn macroeconomics? Why we learn macroeconomics? What is the purpose for learning macroeconomics? So, the first and most important answer to macroeconomics, for learning macroeconomics, is that macroeconomy affects society well-beings. The macroeconomy affects society well-being. How? Look at this data. Each 1 point increase in the unemployment rate is associated with, if there is a 1% rise in the unemployment rate, how it will affect the living standard, how it will affect the behavior and attitude of different citizens. Look at this graph. if we have a 1% increase in the unemployment rate, so 920 more suicides, 650 more homicides, 4,000 more people admitted to state mental institutions, 3,300 more people sent to state prisons, 37,000 more deaths, and increase in domestic violence and homelessness. So homelessness, it means that if we have a 1% increase in the unemployment rate, there will be more suicides, there will be more deaths, there will be more domestic violence, there will be more street crimes. So that's why the macroeconomy affects social well-beings. Look at this graph. We can say that the macroeconomy affects your well-beings. In the first point, we are talking about the society well-being, but in this graph or in this point, we are talking about an individual well-being. It means that how macroeconomy, how the performance of your economy affecting you, how the macroeconomy affect your well-being. So we can see in the graphical representation that we have two lines, we have two graphs. The blue one shows the unemployment rate, whereas the red one shows the inflation adjusted mean wages. So in most years, wage growth falls when unemployment is rising. It means that when the unemployment rate is rising in an economy, wage growth will fall, and vice versa. If the unemployment rate is decreasing, wage growth rate will be increasing. The third point is the macroeconomy affects politics. The macroeconomy affects politics. That's why we have to learn macroeconomics. For example, the unemployment and inflation rate in election years. We have different years. U rate mean unemployment rate, inflation rate, and election outcomes. These are the different presidents of the United States: Bill Clinton, Bush, Jimmy Carter. So look at the first column. In the first column we have year, different periods. Look at the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is fluctuating, 7.7%, 7.1%, 7.5%. So mean decreasing, increasing. Then in the year 1996 we have 5.4%, in 2000 only 4%. It means that the unemployment rate is decreasing. It is the lowest rate in this data. Similarly, for the third column, which is the which consists of the inflation rate. In the year 1980, the inflation rate is 13.5%, which is the highest. Similarly, in the year 1992, the inflation rate is 3%. This was the period of Bill Clinton, who was the President of the United States. Then again, when he was lifting the White House, the inflation rate becomes rising. Like for example, it is 3.3%, 3.4%, 3.3%. So it means that different world leaders, different politicians, different presidents, the decision regarding the selection of a president is also based on the economic condition of the economy. So means people are voting, people are causing vote to different people to select them in order to solve macroeconomic issues like the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, trade deficits, budget deficits, and many more. So the state of the economy has a large impact on election outcomes. The state of the economy has a huge impact on election outcomes. When the economy is doing poorly, when the economy is performing poorly, there trends to be change in the political party that controls the White House of the United States. It means that when the economy is performing poorly, there tends to be a change in the political party, that controls the White House. People will cause vote to someone else if the sitting president of the US is not performing very well, if in that period the US economy is performing very poorly. So the United States citizens will cause vote to someone else in order to solve the major macroeconomic issues. For example, in the 1970s, presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter all wrestled and won with a rising rate of inflation. During the era of 1970s, these three presidents of the US, Richard Nixon, Ford, Jimmy Carter, all these presidents of the United States all wrestled and won with a rising rate of inflation. There was a huge inflation in the era of all these three presidents of the United States. In the 1980s, inflation subsided, but President Ronald Reagan and George Bush presided over large federal budget deficit. Although the problem of inflation has been resolved, but they face the problem of large federal budget deficits. However, in the 1990s, with President Bill Clinton, he was the famous president of the United States. So Bill Clinton in the Oval Office, the economy and stock market enjoyed a remarkable boom. During the period of Bill Clinton, the economy of the United States was booming, and there was a boom in the stock market as well. The budget deficit shrank and even turned into a budget surplus. This was another plus point of the US economy at the time of Bill Clinton, that the US economy budget deficit shrank and even turned into a budget surplus. At that time, the US economy were having surplus budget, which was a good signal for the US economy performance. But as Clinton was leaving office, the stock market was in retreat and the economy was heading into recession. During the time of the Bill Clinton, the economy of the US economy was performing very well. They have a surplus budget. The stock market was performing very well. But when he was lifting his office, at that time the economy was heading into recession. So when President George W. Bush moved into the White House in the year 2001, he reduced taxes, which helped end of recession. So this was the main policy of the George W. Bush. At that time he reduced tax rates in order to cut off the recession, in order to end the recession, and he was succeeded, but also continued to a re-emergence of budget deficit. So in order to end the recession, he reduced the rates of taxes, but there was also the re-emergence of budget deficit. So at the time of George W. Bush, the United States was again facing the problem of deficit budget. So this was the whole discussion that why do we need to study macroeconomics. So we have discussed that macroeconomics affects the society well-being. The macroeconomy affects our well-being. The macroeconomy affects the political system, the election outcome. So the macroeconomy affects politics as well. So hopefully now you have a clear understanding that why we need to study macroeconomics and why the study of macroeconomics is important for all of us. Thank you so much.